There's no way around it. There is the ability to request a Spanish dictionary, but it is not a dictionary that you can bring with you. It is one that is provided on site and is open on site, and it probably takes more time to unwrap the package than most points that you will derive from making that request, and that request has to be made ahead of time. You do not get more time if English is not your first language. And so the schools, I think, have agreed that it's not wise to teach to the test. It's much wiser to teach social work practice, and to assist students in learning about test taking so that they improve their chances of passing the exam on their first attempt. In the future, if you don't pass the exam, you're not a social worker. You can't call yourself a social worker. You can't practice social work. As we move more and more to a managed care environment, managed care companies are going to require the license as well, so that you need it to practice in New York State, will need it to practice with whatever the chain of employer may be, and it makes it very difficult for those agencies that are looking for bilingual, biculturally sensitive and competent practitioners to find individuals who will meet their need to hire licensed personnel. And so we've got to keep working at it, keep trying to get more information about the exam, about the structure of the exam, and more importantly, on what portions of the exam create the most problems for various types of individuals. Younger students versus returning students. Individuals whose first language is not English. So all of those things become issues that the task force has been very much concerned about. The Deans Association has been so about Jeanette, and I actually talked about licensing without having my blood pressure. Which we have been known to have some very heated discussions with the state and the LSWTF personnel. So let me leave it at that, and we can get some higher caliber discussion.
I've been asked to talk about social work programs and their relationship to a neighborhood. I have a PowerPoint, but how do I click? Oh, this must be the clicker. Is it? Yeah. Is it? Yes, sure. Better? Yeah. Okay. So, as I'm sure you know, universities have not had a very good track record in low-income neighborhoods. They generally have either built very high walls to separate themselves from the neighborhood, or sort of ended up gentrifying the neighborhood. This summer in June, we moved from 79th and Lexington, sort of the heart of the Silk Stocking District, to 119th and 3rd Avenue. It's been a fabulous transition for us. We have, just to give you some sense of who we are, we have 1,100 master's students. About 25% of them are Latino, and I think we have 7 Latino faculty members, so 40% of our faculty are persons of color, but we have 7 Latino faculty members. 61% of our incoming class were bilingual, bicultural. They spoke one of 36 languages. We're 92% from New York, which is how we want to be. So we take from New York's communities and we graduate people and we put them back in there. Our new building is the largest public building in East Harlem. There isn't anything that comes close to that. The police station is the next largest building. We're co-located, no, it's true, we're co-located with the CUNY School of Public Health and Centro, the Institute for the Study of Puerto Ricans, which has its archives and library in our first floor, and a wonderful gallery which has great exhibits. So the trick is really going to be to see how we can do neighborhoods right, be a real force for good in the neighborhood. And I want to start by saying that there's a lot more interest in working in communities rather than in individual treatments. One is because of the economic and demographic changes. Clearly, individual services are the most costly services, and as our government shrinks, there's less interest in serving one by one by one. And also because of the changes in our society, becoming more of an immigrant culture, immigrant groups are much more familiar, compatible with group approaches, community approaches, than individual approaches. Also, it's becoming increasingly clear that whatever the problem is that one looks at, be it health disparities or educational disparities or mental health disparities or anything else you can pick, there are what Sampson calls geographic hotspots. There are places where almost every indicator of every, how can I say it, difficult indicator are located. And there are 10 of them in New York City. If I gave everybody a little test, they would pass it in the room about where are the 10 hotspots in New York. And one is clearly East Harlem. And individual services don't seem to show the outcomes that we would hope. And finally, evidence-based practices don't easily generalize to underserved populations. And this morning I had the great urge to change this PowerPoint and put up another reason that community efforts are so interesting today. And it would just say Wall Street on it. Because the current concern on the Wall Street protests with inequality is clearly evident in low-income neighborhoods. So what are we thinking about doing? Well, this one sort of clicks like this. We're thinking about using the concept of social networks, and by that I don't mean Facebook, I really mean the concept of social networks, to talk about, to inform our thinking about our work in East Harlem. There are really three kinds of ties in that theory. One is social supports or strong ties, people's personal ties. Your friends, your family, your people very close to you. And they've been found to be very good for social supports. So if you need to lend money, or you need to babysit, or you need in a crisis, it's usually your tight ties or strong ties that one goes to. The second is weak ties, that is people you know but not your closest ties. And generally the literature has found that these are good for opportunities, leveraging. So employment opportunities, loans, scholarships, etc. generally come from people's weak ties because your own network doesn't know about all the opportunities. And the third are called bridging ties or linking ties, or cross-cutting ties. Evidence shows that they're good for collective advocacy. So community organizations, which can bridge across groups, external to the community, etc., are sort of known to be good for community organizing. So we've used the idea of community building. It comes from Xavier Griggs' work from Harvard, who talks about the importance of bringing networks together to problem solve. And it's interesting to us that if you look at the strategies for community change, they pretty much fall out with networks. So community services, community interventions, services are very related to support networks. Community organizing, community development, very related to weak ties and bridging ties. Community economic development, housing development, beautification, very related to bridging ties. And that's just a little chart that shows you how the connection. The other thing we've talked about at the school is that it's very important to make changes stick. And it's not very easy to do that. So what kind of evidence is around to suggest how change can be sustainable? Well, the first is, what everybody in this room knows, is that you have to make it culturally syntonic. Whatever you're going to do has to fit the culture you're working in. And that can't just mean surface change, like translating your brochure. It really means your service has to accommodate to the people you're working with. So an example in a Latino community might be that you have to do much more family work, much more group work, because people's ties are much more important. The other thing that we think is very important is what's come out of public health models, which is the whole notion of saturating a market or social marketing. So that you can't just introduce a change, you can't just introduce prevention around obesity once. You have to make sure that people reach that information everywhere they are, in their community groups, in their churches, in their families, in their friendship networks, in the services, etc. So we're trying to pay attention to that kind of change. So just very quickly, what have we learned? We're learning social networks are important in community change. We're learning social networks are important both for social support and social leverage. You can't do one without the other. We're learning that economic development does seem to make models change, although it's not very helpful in social supports or social leverage. Just living together, just our being in the neighborhood is not going to help. We really have to consciously plan what we do, use our space and our activity to of some use. We know that professionals make good bridge builders. People talk a lot about teachers as bridge builders, but we think social workers might be good bridge builders too. Deep cultural adaptation is important. And finally, no strategy alone will work. When strategies are implemented together, the result is more than the sum of its parts. And nothing seems to work without participation, buy-in, and empowerment. So how does this all inform our work in East Harlem? Well, first, we have to have the capacity to be a real partner. That means our students, our faculty, have to reflect the community in which we exist. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on ensuring that our student body remains very diverse, increasingly diverse, that our faculty is diverse, and that our curriculum that we use really reflects these issues. So from the very first day our students come into school, in their orientation, they're introduced to this content, and then they take a practice lab which uses an anti-oppression racism frame in their first year. The role of the school as capacity builder is clear and important. We try to bridge ties, we try to convene people, we try to bring some of the organizations into funding sources, into our work. We also try to learn from the community. So we don't always see ourselves as the smartest guy in the room. So right now we're trying to convene something around community security, where we're going to not take the lead. The agencies are trying to talk to us about how issues of security can be best handled. Probably the most fun thing we did was we had a group of senior citizens teach us the bamba, and we all bamba'd out on the street, and that was really fun. We're also using our space to bring community groups in. When you come to our building, you'll see it's very, very open. It's not closed at all. And part of the building is open to the community, so we can both go out, but they can come in. Importantly, we're paying attention to pipelines. Somebody on the panel before us mentioned how few Latinos moved into professions. And I think that the figures are really startling. CUNY, which has all of the community colleges, 6 and soon to be 7 community colleges in New York are all CUNY sponsored institutions. They had 1,000 Puerto Ricans last year. That's really incredible that only 1,000 of the 245,000 students that go to CUNY are Puerto Rican. That's unbelievable. It means that, you know, people who can go to the privates will certainly go and get good funding to do that. But what happens to the others? And if they don't come to CUNY, where do they go? Probably nowhere at all. So we're really trying to pay attention to bringing them along. And finally, we're trying to pay attention to collaborations around serving and learning. We have 98 students placed in East Harlem this year. And they are working on their own service projects in the community. So, and we're encouraging them to do that. They're doing some very, very exciting things. So I hope everybody will come to visit as we roll out this program. Thanks.
Does sound very, very exciting. I guess we're going up and down here with the hopeful and the challenges. We're back to challenges, folks. I'm going to read this because I don't want to leave anything else. Leaving college, also part of CUNY, which prior to 1968 was known as the Bronx campus of Hunter College, is a federally designated Hispanic serving institution, which means that around 50% of the students are Latino. Mirroring the population of the Bronx, the student body is about 50% Latino, and similarly, about half of the students in both the undergraduate and graduate programs are Latino. Both our undergraduate and graduate programs are capped. We admit the same number of students each year, and when the classes are filled, we stop admitting students for that year. We graduate about 140 seniors each year from the undergraduate program, and about half of those, and about 70 students from the MSW program. As about half the students are Latino, between the two programs we introduce about 100 Latino social workers into the profession each year, including 70 undergraduates and around 35 MSWs. Many of the undergraduates enter MSW programs either immediately after graduation, generally as advanced standing students, or several years later after working in agencies as entry-level professionals. As we know, social work education is designed to take place in both social work schools and through field work in agencies in the community. As such, both the schools and the agencies are facing challenges that impact all of us in the profession. All schools are affected by the perfect storm that has emerged in relation to field work. We know that many agencies are struggling with cutbacks in both staff and programs brought about by the economic crisis. This has resulted in the loss of staff available to serve as fieldwork instructors, and some agencies have had to reduce the number of students they can accept for internships. Today there are about 6,000 undergraduate and graduate social work students in the metropolitan area needing fieldwork. Consequently, finding field placements for this number of students has become more difficult. students and for the agencies that provide them. This is a challenge that we all need to begin looking at now. Another challenge affects the undergraduate programs more directly, but also has an impact on field work as well as on graduate programs in the profession. We're here today to talk about how social work can strengthen the Latino community. We're seeing in our undergraduate program a number of Latino students who have excellent conceptual skills and have enormous potential to be fabulous social workers. However, fulfilling this potential is threatened because, for whatever reasons, their mastery of the English language, both written and spoken, is interfering with their progress in field work and with entry into the profession. In a number of cases, agencies have even refused to accept students as interns because of concern about English communication skills. This is the other side of the coin. We usually talk about a student's ability to work in another language, and here what we're seeing, it's a small number. It's certainly, it's not a significant number, but it is a number of students who we would like to find a way of holding onto for the profession. The agencies that have refused to accept students, interestingly enough, are also those who are most in need of Spanish-speaking staff. This is the same situation that, of course, affects other students whose primary language is not English. But since we're here at the Latino Task Force, we'll take this one on here. In the interest of introducing truly bilingual social workers into the profession, we need to become more proactive to help students who are not proficient in English. I was very encouraged this morning when we heard people talking about community, about mentoring, about working within the community in order to create opportunities, more opportunities for Spanish-speaking social workers. Working with students' many strengths, including their Spanish language skills, it's possible to give them the help they need so they will be able to complete the undergraduate degree, move on to an MSW program, certainly be successful in passing the licensing exams, because without that, they're not going to be able to work, and ultimately move into leadership positions within the profession. At this point, merely talking about how this situation has arisen is no longer productive. We can keep doing that with the hope of changing things for the future, but we also need to look for solutions and make this investment in the future now. This is a situation that must no longer be ignored. The schools have a number of programs aimed at developing language skills, but clearly this is not working well enough, and we need to look to the community to find other ways of approaching it. This is an area where agencies and schools can partner in providing a number of different supports for students. For example, there could be a low-cost program in agencies and organizations enlisting retired social workers to serve as volunteer language coaches for students, not only helping them with oral and written communication skills, but doing so within the context of social work practice. I look forward to talking about how we can join together to find new strategies to meet this challenge. Thank you.
Buenos tardes. I have no voice to speak up. So what I unfortunately have is Anna Mobley was the director of Program Special Projects and Operations in the Dean's Office. It's good to be here. It's good to see lots of very good friends from many decades ago. My fear is if I start to cough, I won't stop. So Anna's actually going to do the presentation for me. We're able to get it on PowerPoint, so you'll be able to see it. And if you have any questions later, I'd be happy to try to answer them. So I also, just before I give the microphone over to Anna, I want you to know that I think this is an incredible gathering and such an opportunity to address some very important issues. So my apologies. So actually what I was assigned to do is to talk about the directions that we are seeing emerge in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to let Anna come to the table so that she can see what slides are actually on the screen, okay?
Thank you, Jeanette. So Jeanette was asked, she said, to talk about some of the federal developments and implications. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Partially because of her connections to DC, she served as the Assistant Secretary in the Department of Aging and Health and Human Services under the Clinton years, and she also served her service on the Obama transition team. So she has quite a history working in DC and sometimes has her hand on the pulse of what's going on there. So, I'm supposed to do this to see here, excuse me. There we go. Okay, so first the context. The restructuring of the global political and economic order. So, for example, there's the rise in the BRIC nations. That's Brazil, Russia, India, and China, as well as the rise in our federal debt level, the unsustainability of U.S. engagement in war abroad. We are facing unprecedented national, economic, social, and political challenges. Federal deficit, of course, Congress is seeking to reduce $1.6 trillion of our deficit, partially by reducing $60 billion in cuts in discretionary funding. Rising rates of poverty, homelessness, and unemployment. I think this is the negative part, right? More social problems, less funding, and of course, politically polarized populists. At the same time, there are dramatic demographic changes in the U.S. There's an upsurge in the Latino population, 30% in 2050, that's up from 16% now. In 2042, the prediction is that persons of color in total will constitute the majority, up from 35% presently. And in 2050, persons of color will account for 54% of the U.S. population. Now, to move on to education.
Right. Okay. So when it runs out,
The White House Initiative for Educational Excellence for Hispanics provides advice to President Obama and the Secretary of Education. At the same time, the U.S. affirmative action admissions policy may again be at risk in public universities. So in 1978, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke supported affirmative action by race as a compelling state interest. That was by 1 vote. In 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger upheld use of race as a compelling interest to achieve educational benefits from diversity in admissions, and again, that was by 1 vote. Currently before the U.S. Supreme Court, 2011, of course, Fisher versus University of Texas, Austin. Some predict that it will reverse affirmative action admissions policies. If I were to continue with education, okay. Federal financial aid for students is in jeopardy. So students, okay. Oh, okay. There's more to this slide. I will read it to you. Students of color are heavily impacted by these decreases. The Perkins Grant Program may be on the super committee's radar to become a higher interest rate program. Currently it's at 5% interest, and it may become 6.8%. Also, subsidized Stafford loan for graduate and professional students already has been eliminated effective July 1, 2012. Only unsubsidized Stafford loan will be available to graduate and professional students. Interest will begin as soon as the loan is made. This also, of course, requires co-signers. Let's see where we go here. Now we're going to move on to the Affordable Care Act.
You know, let me just say that we noticed that what's on the screen is not the most recent version of the PowerPoint. So actually what we have here is a more recent version. So Anna will give you, let me see if I can carry this for a while. The Affordable Care Act is actually in great jeopardy, my friends. And, you know, there are good things and bad things about the act for the immigrant population. Some of the bad things, of course, are that undocumented immigrants are required to have coverage, but they do not have affordability credits. And there's a 5-year wait period for enrolling in Medicare and Medicaid for the undocumented, or for, excuse me, lawfully present immigrants. There are some good things. I mean, at least the act will give more people some affordability credits. In fact, there are big challenges that are being raised around the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And so we've got to really watch that. It's being raised by some very conservative groups that say that not every American should be required to have health insurance. And it's also being raised by states that are saying that they don't want to have any requirements to in any way assist people to have health insurance coverage. So I think the next slide will actually return to where we wanted to be. Oops. No, that's okay. No, let's just go with what's on the screen.
I think that Jeanette was leading us to the Class Act. So HHS just announced the Title VIII of the Affordable Care Act. The Class Act, which is the Community Living Assistance Services and Support, is financially unsustainable and will not be implemented. So Title VIII was grassroots driven, supported by the late Senator Ted Kennedy, voluntary LTC public insurance options for employees. So is the defeat, this is the question that Dean Takamura is putting out here, is the defeat of the Class Act a harbinger of things to come? Government-wide, the budget process cannot change mandatory program spending. However, authorizing law for the mandatory program would need to be amended. Currently, 50% of the budget, the federal budget, is for mandatory programming. So that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military retirements, unemployment compensation, child nutrition, etc. There is a push to cut discretionary or non-mandatory, excuse me, I'm not doing everything at once. There is a push to cut discretionary or non-mandatory spending programs. In 2010, 38% of the federal budget, or $1.3 trillion, was made up of discretionary programs. Remember in the previous slide that Congress is seeking to reduce our $1.6 trillion deficit partially with at least $60 billion of cuts in discretionary funding. $815 billion of the discretionary funds were for national security. That's defense and homeland security. Health and Human Services was $84 billion, education $64.3, House and Urban Development $42.8, Justice $27.6, and agriculture $25 billion. So, other federal development and implications. Sorry. So I guess I'll just read to you all. Yeah.
So there is another area that people are not focusing on that I would suggest we give some attention to. And for those of you who have any experience with federal government, what you know is that most of the programs that exist have been programs that are authorized. In other words, there is a law that was passed that says that this is a program that will serve the people of the United States. Unfortunately, many of those laws are not being reauthorized. What does it mean? If a law like TANF, which frankly has struggled to be reauthorized, and the Older Americans Act is not reauthorized, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which includes the Bilingual Education Act, Title VII, for which the Latino community was a leader, if that's not reauthorized, it means that they're not on the books anymore, and Congress and the money committees can say they're no longer laws, really, folks. we don't need to fund them. So it's a very scary scenario. So people look at the federal budget and they kind of, obsess about that. That is one area of focus. But the other area is to know where laws have not been reauthorized. Because no authorization, no need to fund. Okay? There also are, as Anna mentioned earlier, some very important court decisions that are in the offing. The constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is being challenged right now by Shelby County, Alabama, and they're challenging the Department of Justice on this, saying that there should be pre-clearance provisions before people can vote. For example, literacy tests. Okay. And as Anna mentioned earlier, there are also questions about the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. Now, the debt cutting super committee of 12 members is going to be looking at all the discretionary funding programs. Last week, I stayed with a friend of mine who is actually on the staff of OMB, and I have never seen her so agitated in my life. I mean, I literally wanted to take out a bottle of tequila and say, have a few sips here, because she was really agitated. And she said that she has never been through this exercise. It is unbelievable. So besides the discretionary fund programs, I also want to point your attention to the student loan programs. They are very much on the chopping block. What does this mean? There's some final thoughts here. We have an interesting grassroots protest that occurred